Hello and welcome to Encora Global Devweek 2023. My name is Kim Lantis, producer, host of Dojo Live, and also a member of Encora's business development team. This session is going to be all about accessibility for design systems, an especially important topic since a sizable portion of the population experiences living with a disability every day, whether this be circumstantial or a permanent condition. Accessibility is a crucial practice that is oftentimes underestimated. This might be due to time and budget constraints. However, by establishing accessibility standards and principles from the beginning of the design process, we can propose solutions that prioritize, that's a hard word, prioritize accessibility from a fundamental guideline. Now, not only is this beneficial for those with disabilities, but this also enhances the overall user experience and creates a more inclusive and welcoming environment for everyone. Here to tell us how we can make accessibility a priority for our design projects and strive towards more equitable future for all is Elizabeth Arostegui, a user experience designer with seven years of experience in the field. She's been part of companies and organizations such as Tutor, Process Maker, Mojix, Giro 54, and now Encora. So before Elizabeth gets started, we would like to remind all of you watching that you're free to use the chat there to leave your comments and, of course, your questions for Elizabeth. With that, it's our pleasure to learn from you today, Elizabeth. So take it away.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So, I would like to start this webinar reminding that maybe the accessibility concepts that we are going to see here are going to be focused on the process of design systems, okay? In this context, please let me introduce a little about the agenda that we are going to see today. We are going to be, I'm going to guide you through these 6 points. First, understanding the project, maybe conducting user interface audits, maybe create the design inventory for a design system project, the principles versus the patterns of design, but focused on the design, on accessibility, the accessibility testing, and finally, an interface audit that could be helpful for you. Okay, so first, to maybe enter to the topic of design systems, before talking about the accessibility, I have to remind that maybe many companies focused on this type of process. Okay, this is atomic design, and many designers use this process as a base to create their design systems. Okay, Brad Frost is the creator of this process, and he starts with the concept of creating small things like the tokens or the ions, etc. That they have many names for this first stage, the design tokens. And according to him, we can start to create from the smallest things to the big things, like, for example, pages, websites, etc. So we start with the concepts of color, typography, spacing, shadows, etc. Then we create, for example, buttons, input fields. Then we create search boxes, cards, and as you can see, we start from the smallest things to start to create the biggest things. So that's the idea of atomic designs for design systems. And with that in mind, we are going to focus maybe on this process to talk about accessibility in these stages. Okay. First, when we create any kind of design project, we need to understand, obviously, the project and the users. So we know that a design system is a project to create projects, okay? But that doesn't mean that a design system doesn't have, for example, requirements, minimum requirements. And obviously, when we ask our stakeholders about which could be these requirements, we need to focus also in accessibility, because this is a thing that maybe we don't consider at the beginning. We always think, we have to solve that problem, we have to solve that requirement, but we don't consider maybe this is going to be useful for certain kind of users. Okay, we find a user, yes, a final persona for that design system, but we don't consider, for example, that that person could have problem with the eyes, a problem with the, for example, that person can have can have a disability to moving. Okay, so maybe we can have those kind of problems. So we need to consider that kind of things as for final requirements when we get the feedback from our stakeholders. Okay, and for example, to ensure that every project um, for example, meets the accessibility needs, we need to talk about that with a person or per people who is going to be trained in these accessibility principles. Okay, maybe there are a certain group of people inside the company that could know about that, but also that doesn't mean that the accessibility topic is only going to be focused on that team. Okay, they are like people who are going to train the whole company about this. Okay, and as designers, we always use this awesome tool for design that is called personas. Okay, we create these profiles with maybe they are realistic. They are more like an example of people that could use our system. But when we create these personas, we are not going to more frequently we don't consider that this could be real people with disabilities. We always think that they are going to be normal people with a normal sight, with normal hearing. Okay, but for example, in this examples I'm going to show you here, Rosenfeld Media has suggested that we could consider other kinds of profiles. In this case, for example, autism or maybe elders, and they suggest this in this resource. Maybe you can Google it later. They have these examples of persona profiles that we could include in our set of personas for our project. This is not mandatory. There are many of these profiles, and there are other kinds of disabilities too. But for example, we can include them, and they could be very useful for us to get empathy with them. Then, and the second stage maybe could be conducting interface audits. What about if our project, our system, for example, has already been created, a legacy product, for example? We already have users for that, and we don't know exactly what was the feedback that they gave us. And worst, maybe we don't know what kind of users with disabilities have been using that system. So to conduct a usability audit, we need to, for example, create a quick checklist, maybe to understand, for example, what aspects that legacy product is not, for example, is not successful, and we have to consider to change or maybe improve in our next version of the system of the product. Okay, for example, in this case, the font size, color contrast, labeling, etc., or maybe something too basic, like for example, alternative descriptions for images. Maybe in those previous versions of that product, we never considered to add that. Okay, so with this in mind, we have to conduct these audits, okay, design audits, periodically, not always, but maybe one every certain period of time, to understand what happened. And with that information, if we are designing a new design system with all of those, with all of that background before, we have to create these evaluations, and we can use it to improve our new version of the design system too. Now, the next step is create a design inventory. Now that we know what we have, maybe which could be our weaknesses, then we can create an inventory of what we have now, but visually for the UI. Okay, and this is interesting because it's not like work that we can do very, very quick, because this is very really touchy work. We have to take screenshots of, for example, a simple component like a button, But check this component in all the pages of the product, okay? So we can see, for example, the variations of the product of that, of that component, and check which of these stages of the which forms it has, the sizes, the states, etc. So this is going to be very useful for us. And also, talking about accessibility, we have to check, for example, the hover states. Does it have the focus states? For example, focus is a very, very useful state for screen readers. So this is going to be very helpful for us to understand what was done and now what we can do to improve that. If for example, that state of focus doesn't exist, we have to add. Okay, that's very useful for accessibility context. And as a plus, maybe it could be useful to take screenshots of the component with, for example, a disability simulator. There are many of these tools in the internet, but maybe one that I can suggest to take these screenshots with different disability simulator. We can use, for example, this tool that's called Spectrum. It's a plugin, no, sorry, it's an extension that we can use from Chrome. I think there is one for Firefox too, one version for Firefox, and it's very useful. So it's very helpful. You can install it. It's very quick, and you can see how the page changes for different types of view disabilities. So you can check that. It's pretty interesting. So maybe for our screenshots, going to be very useful. Then, following the steps of Brad Frost, previously we have first we have to define, for example, the colors, typographies, etc. So to enter to that process, we have to start with the color. So the first step when we create a design system is the color, obviously, and also the typography and the spaces. All those items that we are going to use to create the next components. So in this case, we have to consider that color is a very huge problem right now. As you can see in this with these statistics, 300 million people worldwide have problems with the vision deficiency. So, for example, in this case, this is the normal view, but also we have many issues here. And well, one of the less knowns is the monochromacy. Maybe many people is not familiar with this, but there's people who can't see colors. So this is very rare, but could happen. So in order to, for example, overcome this barrier here, so we always consider when we design to use a normal palette of colors, but we have to consider use other types of visual indicators here, not only color. But if you would like to use color, you have to consider this, okay? Maybe many people is not going to recognize many colors. There are many ways to overcome, to solve this problem. For example, use patterns, etc., spaces, sizes, so you can differentiate items. But this is something that we have to consider in this stage. There are tools that are very helpful for us. For example, in this case, Contrast Grid is a tool that helps you to check the contrast levels between the colors. For example, which colors could have the high contrast and are very useful for the user. So they are going to recognize items very fast, and they are going to be very legible. But there are other combinations of colors, as you can see. For example, this red label says does not pass. These are combinations that we are not going to use, right? Because this is not, for example, a good combination of colors. Okay, so the idea here with this tool is to use the color combinations that have a AAA standard, or at least a AA, because this is the high contrast level and we can use it. But the other ones, maybe no. And we can document it in our design system, so we can prevent our team to not use this combination. So this is a tool that could be very helpful. Also, other tool that we could use to check color disabilities is Stark, and has a plugin in Figma that's very wonderful. We can check the variations between different sites, disabilities, and we can compare them between each other in our Figma file. Right now, it's not for free. It has a 30-day free trial, but it's very useful. I recommend it if you need it. Also, there are tools for example, desktop, like this sim daltonism for Mac. As you can see, you can install it and check how daltonic people can see the images. Then the second stage maybe is typography. And when we are going to use, for example, or select fonts or the font combinations for our design system, is very useful to understand the font space, font sizing, because it's not the same to use a very tight paragraph for bodies for body typography than a very separated, for example, between the lines composition. So this is not a good practice. Maybe we could use like we can have a balance between these two. Okay, maybe we can consider that the spaces for when we are going to, for example, use the fonts for paragraphs. But I think the most useful here is the selection of the typeface. Okay, because we always consider as designers to use the most beautiful typeface, the most trend, but it's very useful to have this consideration. In this case, I'm comparing these two typographies. One is Jill Sans and the other is Verdana. As you can see, the characters for I, L, and the number 1 in Jill Sans look the same practically. It's very difficult to differentiate between them. But in the case of Verdana, we can see the difference and it's really recognizable. So now you can recognize between the I, the L, and the 1 very quickly. It's very legible for the user. So try to not only following the beauty of that font, and also consider how well are designed the characters from each font. Okay. Then we have to define the hierarchy of the headings. So for titles, for example, I'm going to use this size of typography, and this bold is going to be more recognizable than not, for example, document that. So in design system, we have in our design system or UI kit, we are going to have a section exclusively to document that part. And that's going to be very useful for the user because they are going to be able to recognize sections very easily with the separations, etc. Also for the links, all the highlighted text. That's going to be very useful. And also for when we are talking about images, and most designers forget to configure or to set the text for the alternative text. Or sometimes we add an alternative text that is not very very useful for blindness people. So maybe, for example, we can be more descriptive when we are going to tag that image. I have to say that most of the time we have to use alternative text for images that are going to that are really helpful for the user. In that case, for example, cards or products. For example, if we are in an e-commerce site and we have as the list of items that e-commerce is selling, that's going to be really useful that the alternative text for the products is going to be very, very descriptive. Okay, because they are going to like create an image in their minds about what we are selling. And not only for example, in this case, not only a cute cat. We have to tell here is a cat orange that has green eyes, etc. Okay, we can be more descriptive with these images. Also consider the responsiveness of the typography for the different devices. For body, for example, for a desktop device, it's useful, for example, between the 16 to 18 pixels size for the normal text, for the paragraph text. But in the case of mobile, we have to reduce a little the size of the text because it's going to be too huge, and we have we have a reduced space here, so we have to consider that. And the same we have to do with the titles. If we are, for example, adding a title of 40 pixels here, that's going to be very huge and unreadable. Maybe in mobile, where we have to reduce to 28. We don't know exactly. It's going to be a decision of the user, a decision of the designer, and we have to make that change here. So it's different, right, for every type of device. Also, talking about the next step, talking about the design patterns, and in according to the Brad Frost Brad Frost process proposal methodology, we have the atoms, the molecules and the other items after that. So we have to consider, for example, this kind of material here. This page is called the inclusive components, and it's a really interesting resource where we can find many of these components, but they have suggestions related to the accessibility of each component. For example, I'm going to share here the cards, and well, at the beginning of my career, I was a front-end developer. And I remember that when I was creating the cards for a website, I always was accustomed to use divs, for example. And here, for example, in this page, they suggest if we are using cards like stack cards, one after other, we can use Lee, the tag Lee from HTML instead of just divs, because this gives you the opportunity to the screen readers to read one item after other. Every tag in HTML is very useful for the screen readers and has a meaning, has a purpose. So we have to be very skilled to know which of these tags we could use and are the right use for every component. In this case, as I told you, for cards, it's very useful to use lists, and they have many. They have many suggestions here how you could lay out your component. And also, for example, you can enumerate every card, so the screen reader is going to jump one card after other and tell the blindness users how these cards are layouted and the content of every card. Finally, the testing. And obviously, we know that it's very difficult to recruit users. For example, in my case, for a B2B company, with IT admin users, is really difficult to find the right the right people, because they are very specialized users. I know that's very difficult, but if you have the possibility, please, it's very useful to add one person, one user with a disability. But a disability that could be relevant for your project, right? In this case, for example, a blind person, right, could be very useful, and add them to the list of recruited users, so you can check with them and run the testing and the usability test with them. From development side, maybe we can say that they have to review the standards for HTML patterns. It's a really hard job, because they need to know HTML. That's a really easy language, but they need to learn in the high level. So they need to know very well how, for example, a tag works, what's the purpose of the tag, not only use the tag just because it's pretty or is fast with that tag. Okay, they need to know the meaning of every HTML tag and use it as is, for example, as an standard to improve the accessibility of the project. As I told you, for example, lists or headers for H1s, H2, etc. They are very useful to name the page. So the developer has to be knowledge on that point. And finally, the handoff and documentation process. This is going to be very useful for us as designers, because we design very beautiful things in Figma or Adobe XD, etc., Sketch, but we don't know how to deliver that to the developer, and worst, we say nothing about accessibility practices. So for example, one of the best practices is obviously name the pages, okay? For example, assign categories for the pages, so the file is going to be very well designed, very well organized, and the developers are going to recognize what design belongs to which stage, or if that design has been approved, etc. So that's going to be very useful. We have an awesome article in the Encora blog that's going to be very, very useful. Obviously, for every small component, we need, for example, document not only the normal state, we need to document also the other states of that component. In this case, in the case of buttons, we need to, for example, document the focus, obviously, because this is going to be useful for the screen readers. The hover states, obviously, that's going to be useful, even though we are not going to use in our common mockups, because it's going to be a little heavy. It's going to be very heavy in the prototyping, but this is going to be useful for developers, because they are going to know how this company is going to look when they are going to lay out in the project. It's very useful to have this document too. This is the focus flow. So, for example, we have here the example of a page. It's an empty page with a navigation. We have the logo, navigation items, and the search. So the screen reader, how we would like that this screen reader is going to flow between these items. So the first, for example, the start of the screen reader would be the main content. I mean the whole page. But if the user clicks tab, okay, or the next button to choose the next step, the next item would be the logo. So we can go home, etc. Then the first item of the navigation bar, etc. So this is the order where the screen reader is going to follow in order to to guide the user through the whole page, because we are, as we can see here, we are talking about users that can't see. So they are just clicking tap, tap, tap to go to the next item. And this is going to be very, very helpful to handoff. Then we have, for example, a possibility to suggest the developers the kind of tags that they could use in the pages. For example, in this case, the H1, this is a very important tag, because this tells the screen reader what's the page about. In this case, this is the datos viajeros, in this case, traveling, maybe in English. So in this case, we suggest the developers to use the H1 here, because that's the purpose of the page in this case. Okay, so we suggest them to use H1, and these small indicators here are small components that we can add in our Figma file too. So they are going to be able to know, oh, this is not something that we have to draw in the page, but this is an indicator of what we could use here for a HTML tag. Because as we know, in Figma, we don't have the possibility to show the tags. We just have CSS, but this is very useful to show to the developers, so you can have that documentation too. And that's for all. Thank you very much.
That was a great session, Elizabeth. Thank you. I particularly enjoyed how you laid out, the steps in a very easy to follow way. I think the steps were very tangible. Your examples and your visual examples were very clear to follow. I am partial to the cute cat example myself. And of course, you even had some recommended tools to use. And I really liked how it wasn't just focused on the designer's responsibility, right? To be accessible, that you're able to incorporate the entire team in terms of suggested tags that developers can utilize. What has your experience been like with getting developers on board with accessibility? Has that been an easy thing, or has there been some resistance?
It's very difficult, because at the beginning, as I told you, I started as a front end, and we want that the project runs very fast. Okay, we want to implement it now, and that's all what we want. But then we realized that we got some issues. We have some problems because screen readers doesn't work. Maybe we can't find the different many different states for example the different components like buttons, input fields. We find those issues, and they are like a snowball that start very small and they start to grow, grow, and at the end it's a mess. So it's very useful to start here. As I told you, using the atomic design process, it starts from the beginning, from the small components, to create the biggest ones, right? The whole pages. So it was a mess here right now, starting to relearn, for example, HTML, relearn the standards. It's very complex, but it can be done. And yes, everything is testing always, right? Because maybe we can fail in some things and we can improve later.
Yeah, I mean, and despite the resistance, I think once you start to see the ease of doing it right the first time, as they say, and then of course the benefit that this offers to your users, it's fantastic. I did notice that you focus mostly or mainly on visual impairments. Why was this? Is it just because that's the largest portion of the population?
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe yes, because in this case, Figma, for example, doesn't offer you options for example, people with other kind of disabilities, right? It's more visual, and in this case, when we are going to create a design system, is going to be very visual. So I think that's one of the main goals here. But maybe in other sessions we can review other types of disabilities too.
Certainly, auditory people who lack mobility and things like that. That's fantastic. Well, this has been great. Thank you, those of you who are watching, for joining us. Of course, let us know in the comments what you enjoyed most about Elizabeth's session today, what you learned today. And of course, if you got questions there, include those too. She'll be ready to answer them for you. And again, thank you for joining us. I hope that you'll join us again here on Encora Dev Week. You can check out all of our sessions and upcoming sessions on our official website, which is devweek.encora.com, or simply stick around because the next session is pretty much right now. Bye for now.